So I rarely order something and then, had eyes bigger than my stomach and have to bring leftovers home. But every now and then, and that's kind of what we did metaphorically last week. We went to we went out to eat. We ordered a big dinner, and it was more than we could take in one lesson. So we got a little bit of leftovers tonight. It's kind of the metaphor of what I'm going to go with here, okay? So we went to Garcia's, got the El Magnifico, and it was just a little too much. So I had a few people talk to me after last week's lesson, and I said, there's some things that I just had to cut out, and I'm thinking about maybe doing it next week because I just, I didn't want it to be a 2-hour lesson last week, and a few people said, well, I hope you do. I'd like to hear the rest of it. And again, when I say the rest of it, a subject like angels, we'll never really know the rest of it or the whole story. We're just left with, bits and pieces and some behind-the-scenes glimpses that help us understand sometimes what angels are not, or demons, or, spiritual things like that, what they are not, what they don't do. A little bit helps us what they do accomplish, but we don't have every question answered. And that's going to be the case tonight, but there was definitely a lot left unsaid after last week's lesson. So, in our first 2 lessons in the series, we talked about demons. We were able to come to some conclusions, but a lot of that we had to leave up to, maybe we'll know more when we get to the other side of eternity. And same thing with angels last week. We considered just the basic questions regarding angels and demons, each in their own lesson. What's their origin? Where do they come from? What are they? How powerful are they? And with both, we noted that they are certainly created beings. On the spectrum, there's nothing that is anywhere near equal with God. He is the only truly eternal being. He inhabits eternity. He is self-existent. He has no beginning, has no ending. He grants eternal life to us and to certain spiritual beings, but we are all created by him. He is the source. So there is none that comes anywhere near. Perhaps angels and demons are not that different, that demons are simply angels who have, for whatever reason that we can't understand, have chosen to reject God and rebel and sin. But I think the same is true of human beings. Why would anyone make that choice, in this life, to reject God and sin against him? But perhaps that is the simple distinction between angels and demons. But there's a few particular questions and specific examples we want to look at tonight. So there's going to be 4 of them, 4 points. We're going to talk about, first of all, Michael, the archangel. We'll talk about Gabriel. We'll talk about cherubim and seraphim. That's going to be our lesson for tonight. It's just a little glimpse, a little taste of what the Bible tells us about the only 2 angels that are given names, Michael and Gabriel, and 2 other types of beings that seem to exist or inhabit the heavenly or spiritual realm beyond the physical that we read about. That's the cherubim and the seraphim. So Michael is given the specific designation as the archangel. Again, only 2 angels are given names. Michael is one of them, and he's singled out in Jude verse 9. If you'll turn over to Jude verse 9, he is identified and given the title of archangel. And that title simply means chief or highest angels. You could think of, overarching or above. So he's kind of at the high point here. This seems to indicate that he is in some sort of leadership or authority position, or perhaps even in command of other angels. But here again is kind of our whole study. This point right here sums up our whole study on angels and demons. We kind of get a little bit of the parameters, but the specific answer still escapes us. It tells us that there's some sort of hierarchy among angels, but beyond having angels and we've got an archangel, beyond that, we don't really know if there's any more detail to this hierarchy. Jude verse 9 gives a lot of interesting details here about a story, and again, another one that I wish I knew a whole lot more about what Jude is telling us here in verse 9 of his letter. But Michael the archangel, when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against him a railing judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." Well, we can learn a pretty good lesson out of that verse, but what the specifics of their debate? Boy, I'm stumped. I wish I knew. There's some speculation out there. Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 6 says that when Moses died, he was 120 years old, he was still pretty vigorous and had great eyesight. It says that when he died, there at the end of Deuteronomy, just before going into the promised land, he got a glimpse of it. And then it says that God took his body and buried it somewhere, and no person, no human knew where that was. So this has led to all kinds of speculation. Was the devil perhaps staking his claim on the body of Moses, that it belongs to me and God shouldn't have hid it? What was his motives? Did he want to use the body of Moses for like some sort of shrine, and so that people would worship Moses and kind of pull them away from God, kind of distracting them from who they really should be worshiping? We're not really sure. It's just I wish I knew exactly what the purpose of this debate was, but there are a few lessons we can draw here. It says that he dared not. Well, let me read it here, and I have a hard time because I've got a friend from 11, 12 years ago when I lived in California, and he always had the King James Version, and he called it the Durst Version. That was what he called it, because here in verse 9 it says, "But Michael the archangel durst not pronounce a railing judgment." And he's like, what does durst mean? So anyway, it means he does not. That's why we don't really like the King James in today's modern English. But so I always have a hard time remembering the specific wording, but it says he was disputing with the devil, so he's not shying away from this. He's standing up. Whatever this debate was particularly about, the details, again, I don't know, but Michael wasn't backing away. He was standing his ground, but he was doing it the right way. It said he did not dare pronounce against him a railing judgment. Some translations even include in there slanderous, basically insulting. This is when a debate, like modern day politics or what you see, people call debates on Facebook, it just turns into two angry people insulting each other. Not a lot of actual debate or exchange of ideas is happening, but it kind of falls apart into simply name calling. And it says Michael didn't do that. Also, it says he did not pronounce against him. He said, "The Lord rebuke you." Michael understood his place. Romans chapter 12 and verse 19 says we need to leave room for the wrath of God. "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." And this is a great reminder. We see in Michael someone who stood his ground, was arguing his point, but was not being brought down to Satan's level, simply insulting or foul language or things like that. So there's a great lesson there in that verse, and it tells us a little bit about his character. And again, it mentions that he is the archangel. The only other place that mentions that is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 16, but here it doesn't identify Michael specifically. It just has a reference to the archangel. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 16. "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ shall rise first." And then we who are alive will meet them up there, and it's judgment and then eternity. But again, he says that the archangel will be there with a shout. Remember that verse, because we're going to talk about the trumpet when we get to Gabriel in our next point. So these are the only two references to archangel, but the name Michael comes up in the Old Testament as well. That name means who is like God. This is kind of a rhetorical question. The idea is there's really no answer to this question because there's none like God. As we pointed out in our lesson this morning about, hallowed be thy name, may people honor your name as holy. Holy means set apart, unique, different, not common, not like things you see here in this world, but completely and entirely set apart and different. That's God. And so Michael's name hints at that, and Michael's name, again, draws attention away from him and brings glory to God. There is none like God. That's the answer to that question. And we see him particularly in the book of Daniel. Again, this seems to hint at the fact that when Bible verses talk about, principalities and rulers and such in the heavenly places, that there's certainly measures of authority and positions of authority even in the heavenly places. And as the archangel, again, this seems to indicate he's got some sort of position, perhaps above the other angels. Before we go there, let me also point out Revelation chapter 12. I'm still in the New Testament, so I thought I'd just read this before I go back to the book of Daniel. But Revelation chapter 12 and verse 7, keeping in mind that Revelation is symbolic and it represents primarily events that have, from our point of view, already happened 2,000 years ago, roughly. But again, it gives us some insight. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 7, it has a reference to Michael. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. And the dragon and his angels waged war. I don't want to read too much into this, but this is a thought that occurred to me as I was studying through this the last couple of weeks, is perhaps as we did a basic series of questions on demons and then on angels, the question of how powerful are they? And I just kind of put a spectrum. God is here, infinite, no one is near him. Man is here, angels and demons are somewhere between. We talked about the devil and his angels, a reference there in Matthew 25. They seem to be subservient to him. I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but maybe this could hint at that Michael and the devil are perhaps on the power spectrum somewhere near equal, because you have Michael and his angels, the devil and his angels. And in Daniel chapter 10, I think it kind of hints at that possibility. Again, just a possibility. This is what we're left to do, is speculate, but I don't want to be presumptuous. A little bit of speculation is fine as long as it doesn't become we presume to know the truth. And I certainly don't presume to know this to be the absolute truth. Just kind of connecting the dots, this is one possible indication here. Daniel chapter 10, you have this really kind of odd story. Have you ever, said a prayer and you kind of felt like a delay? Why isn't God answering me? Well, maybe there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than you realize. Daniel chapter 10 describes how Daniel was praying and for 21 days, for 3 weeks, he was kind of waiting for an answer. Chapter 10 of Daniel, let's begin in verse 10. Then behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man of high esteem, understand the words that I'm about to tell you and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words. He says, I'm here in an answer to your prayer. Daniel has seen visions, and he was asking God for help in interpreting and understanding those visions. And so this angel says, look, I'm an answer to that prayer. I'm going to come and help you understand the visions. And I'm going to give you more visions and teach you what their meaning is. Verse 13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. It seems like he's indicating, I meant to come to you sooner, but I was delayed. The prince of the kingdom of Persia. This is another one where I'm going to do a little bit of speculation, a little bit of my best guess here. I believe that since most of the latter half of Daniel is highly symbolic and figurative, I'm going to say this isn't the literal human being sitting on the throne in Persia. I want to say this represents Satan. This represents darkness. This represents evil in a spiritual sense, as in Persia represented an evil nation, and the influence and power behind them was of the devil. And so that's my suggestion on what's being said here. But he says, for 21 days, the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. Then behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to give you understanding. And so it seems to me like maybe this king of Persia, this prince of Persia, whoever's being described here, was someone that the angel could resist but couldn't quite overcome. But he says, then Michael, one of the chief princes, came, and that he seemed to overcome this obstacle and allowed the angel to now come to Daniel. And again, there's another reference in chapter 12 to Michael. So it's hard to piece all this together and come to a solid conclusion. And I wish I had more to tell you about Michael. If you go to Ephesians chapter 6, we just need to be reminded that there's so much going on all the time that we aren't privy to seeing. I wish I knew more about Michael, but I'll tell you this, I'm glad what little I know about him, I'm glad to say that he is on my side, and he is on your side, because he obeys God and because he carries out the will of God. So in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 10, Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God that you may be able to resist the evil day and having done everything to stand firm, therefore, having girded your loins with truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace, in addition to all, taking up the shield of faith with which you will be able to extinguish all the flaming missiles of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, with all prayer and petition. Pray at all times in the Spirit, and with this in view, be on the alert with all perseverance and petition for all the saints. So there's a lot going on that we don't see, and as I concluded last week's lesson on angels, we don't know every specific of what their work is. But we understand that when God needs things done, they're the ones at times that carry that out, that carry out his orders and make it happen. When God promises, we can count on his promise. And sometimes angels are the agents who carry out his will and follow his orders. So I wish I knew more about Michael, but he seems to be very powerful, very faithful, and very obedient to God, and I'm thankful that as we gird ourselves with all the preparation we can with the gospel to fight the spiritual battle, that he's fighting with us and for God. The other named angel that we have in the Bible is Gabriel. And Gabriel, as we talked about angels, the name is less of a name and more of a description of what they are and what they do. Messengers. Gabriel was a very busy messenger in both testaments. His name means the strength of God. We see in Daniel, so again, go back to Daniel chapter 8. So in the book of Daniel, we encounter both Gabriel and Michael. But here, and he's sent to help Daniel understand the message. Daniel chapter 8, beginning in verse 16. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So he came near to where I was standing. When he came, I was frightened, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Now while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, and he touched me and made me stand upright. And he said, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of... And so he goes on to describe, he was sent there by God to help Daniel understand the content of his vision. The content of Daniel's vision deals with the end of the nation of Israel. Just read Daniel coupled with Matthew chapter 24. That's my recommendation. You'll see a lot of parallels there, but we're not in a study of Daniel tonight. That's just a side point. But again, chapter 9 and verse 21, while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. And he gave me instruction and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you insight with understanding. At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. So give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. Again, Gabriel says, I've come here as a messenger to help clarify things for you, to help give you insight and understanding into the visions you've seen. Other translations say that in verse 21, Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, came to me swiftly. And it's kind of a joke that to catch people in prayer, some people today, he would have to move very swiftly indeed. In the New Testament, Luke chapter 1 and verse 19, this is a great verse. Again, it tells us a little bit about the existence of angels, where they exist, where they inhabit. They're in the presence of God. So he was sent to Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, and he was sent to, again, as a messenger to tell him, you're going to bear a son, and he's going to be the fulfillment of all those Elijah prophecies, a forerunner who would come and prepare the way for the Messiah, who would come in the spirit and power of Elijah. That's going to be your son, Zacharias. So in Luke chapter 1 and verse 19, he said, and the angel answered and said, I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God. So that tells you a little bit about him right there. Stands in the presence of God. How awesome that must be. And I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. A little bit later in verse 26, now in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a city in Galilee, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph. Verse 28, he said to her, "Hail, favored one, the Lord is with you." And she was greatly troubled at this statement. And so the angel says to her in verse 30, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Jesus. He will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end." So he got to declare the good news to Mary and say, you get to give birth to the Messiah. This is going to be the chosen one of God. So with Gabriel, we have a few more examples, a few more stories about him in the Bible. But he certainly is fulfilling the namesake of angel. He's a messenger, and he was quite busy. This is kind of one of those mistaken because of pop culture. There's a song that attributes, Gabriel as the one that blows the trumpet. Gabriel, blow your horn, is the words in the song. So a lot of people have this idea that he's the one, or there's depictions in art or statues or sculptures of him. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 16 says that when God comes back, it's with a shout and with the blast of the trumpet, but nowhere does it say Gabriel is the one playing the trumpet. So just one of those side points. So that's what we know about Gabriel. A few examples in Daniel where he's sent to help Daniel understand some things. A few examples in the Gospel of Luke where he is sent to, again, declare messages to Zacharias and to Mary. Now, on to a couple other beings that exist in the spiritual realm. We have the cherubim. It is not a chubby pink little baby with wings. By the way, I forgot to mention this last week. The background I put up there, the angel with the wings, there in the clouds, I did that on purpose but failed to mention that last week. Angels are spoken of as flying, but nowhere does it describe them as having wings. So I did that picture on purpose, kind of, to be ironic. But cherubim and seraphim are described as having wings. Not angels, but the cherubim and seraphim. The word cherubim means to till or plow. It makes you think of like an oxen, some sort of beast of burden, some sort of animal that is dependable, strong, providing service for the Lord. The first biblical reference is pretty early in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 24. God places cherubim outside the garden to protect it. Now, when you go to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 7, it kind of makes you wonder, is this part of their job today? That in Genesis 3 they were guarding it in the sense of keeping people out of it. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 7 talks about, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God." Same type of sentiment in chapter 22 and verse 14 about the tree of life and about paradise. And I always find it not in the slightest bit coincidental, but pretty cool that the Bible begins in Genesis with paradise lost, and it ends in Revelation with saying that if you overcome and you're faithful, you get to enter into paradise. So I just kind of wonder, again, more speculation than actual fact, but the earliest reference is them, placed as guards to keep Adam and Eve and mankind after them out of the garden. How long were they doing this? All the way up till the flood when everything was destroyed? Doesn't really say, but that's the first reference. They were there guarding it. So again, we know them to be beings of pretty good power. Exodus chapter 25 is the next reference we have to them. And if you've ever been in a Bible class as a kid, or maybe you were a teacher and did this, I've got an uncle back home in Oregon that the kids love it when he teaches the Bible class. He's an orthodontist. He's really good with small tools and, craft stuff. And he's made a, model of the temple, I think, and he's made, small model of the Ark of the Covenant. So in Exodus chapter 25, if you've ever seen a scale model of it, or I guess if you've seen Indiana Jones, but You know that they are on top of the Ark of the Covenant. Exodus chapter 25, not literally, but a representation of them. Exodus 25 and verse 18. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Make them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end and 1 cherub at the other end. You shall make the cherubim of one piece with the mercy seat as its 2 ends. And the cherubim shall have their wings spread upward, covering the mercy seat with their wings and facing one another. But again, not much description of what they look like here, but we get that in Ezekiel. And this is a pretty crazy description here. The question I always have with, descriptions of things that are more spiritual than physical is, how literally do we take these descriptions? If we go to Ezekiel chapter 1, I have no doubt that this is exactly what Ezekiel saw. My question isn't, is this what Ezekiel saw? My question is this simply a physical representation? What he was shown was something physical that symbolized something spiritual. He saw a physical creature, but that was just a manifestation of something that he could see. Because I wonder sometimes, is the spiritual reality is heaven, is the full glory of God, or the glory of these angelic beings, is it too much for us to really understand what we're seeing? So at times, we mentioned last week, angels appear in the form of a person. Sometimes a person that's bright, but still a human form that we can perceive. So that's just a question I don't have an answer to, but I have no doubt that this is what Ezekiel saw. Chapter 1 and verse 5. And within it there were figures resembling 4 living creatures, or 4 living beings. And this was their appearance. They had human form. So again, he says a human form. That's their appearance. That's what they had the form of, but is that what their substance really is? Again, that's my question that I don't necessarily have an answer to. But here's what he saw. They had a human form. Each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. And their legs were straight, and their feet were like a calf's hoof. They gleamed with burnished bronze. Under their wings and on their 4 sides were human hands. As for the faces and wings of the 4 of them, their wings touched one another. Their faces did not turn when they moved. Each went straight forward. As for the form of their faces, each had the face of a man. All 4 had the face of a lion on the right and the face of a bull on the left. All 4 had the face of an eagle. Is this literally what they are? Or did Ezekiel see something that was a representation symbolically that teaches us about them? That each of these animals teaches us about their characteristics. That like a lion, they're courageous and strong. Like an ox, they're dependable and serviceable for God. Like a human, they have intellect and the ability to reason. And like an eagle, they have vision, they can see great distances. Is this a description of their characteristics, or is it literally what they are? I'm not exactly sure. One thing is for certain, though, they seem to be associated with the throne of God. You remember Exodus chapter 25, that description we read about the Ark of the Covenant? That's literally described as the mercy seat, a throne, a seat for God. Now, in Ezekiel, it gets pretty confusing. There's a lot of people that have come up with these theories that Ezekiel is describing not God, but a flying saucer. That's the ancient aliens type theory. I admit it does get kind of interesting descriptions, but again, maybe Ezekiel saw some things that were just a little bit too incredible for the human mind to really understand and describe. But they seem to be associated with the movement of God. Go over to Ezekiel chapter 10. In both of these descriptions, it says each cherubim, there's 4 of them, each of them had a wheel, which indicates movement. And so God would have his throne above them, and they would move God as if, like, you can kind of imagine, in the old days, like a pharaoh, you'd have the 4 guys carrying him on his throne, and they'd move him that way. I don't know if that's exactly the image we're supposed to get here, but Ezekiel chapter 10 and verse 14, it says there that each one had 4 faces, and again, describing them, what they were. Verse 20, these are the living beings that I saw beneath the God of Israel by the river Chebar. So I knew that they were cherubim. Each one had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings, and beneath their wings was the form of human hands. As for the likeness of their faces, they were the same faces whose appearance I had seen by the river. Each one went straight ahead. They're described as, in chapter 10, Ezekiel sees God is upset with Judah, so he sees the presence of God leave the temple and go to the cherubim, and they carry his presence away. Kind of a description of the throne. Other references here, Psalm 80 and verse 1. I think this clarifies a little bit more their purpose. Psalm 80, verse 1. O give ear, shepherd of Israel, thou who dost lead Joseph like a flock, thou who art enthroned above the cherubim. As Exodus chapter 25 describes the mercy seat, and 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 2. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him to Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the very name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. You could think of them as his personal attendants, perhaps. They're associated with his movements, so they go with him. They are associated with his throne and with the mercy seat. So I don't know how much more descriptive I can be than that, but that is some of the indications we have regarding their work. And the final beings we have for consideration are the seraphim. Their name means the burning ones. Maybe this indicates their zeal, their intense zeal for God and for carrying out his will. I have no clue how to differentiate. I kind of came up with this power spectrum. I have no way to differentiate between cherubim or seraphim, which one outranks the other, which one is more powerful than the other. There's really no indication whatsoever between the two of them, but they're described differently and seem to be given slightly different purposes. Where the cherubim are associated with the throne of God and his movements, the seraphim are often associated with the praise of God. Isaiah chapter 6, and this is a great chapter about their name, the burning ones. Isaiah, you remember that chapter there? We just studied it a few weeks ago on Wednesday night. Isaiah is given this incredible glimpse. The curtain of reality and all this physical is pulled back, and he gets this incredible, awesome glimpse into eternity and to see the throne of God and all the angels and the seraphim singing his praises. And what's Isaiah's reaction? I'm a man of impure lips, and I dwell among impure people. So what does a seraphim do? A seraphim takes a hot coal, touches it to his lips as an act of purifying. Again, I think more what we're seeing here is symbolic than literal, because we don't get any description of Isaiah coming back with scalded or burned or scarred lips. This is symbolically representing that it's a purification. But in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 2, seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and this could be an indication of humility. A lot of times, Eastern monarchs, the attendants that were with him would have covered faces and covered feet as a sign of humility. And the idea of the covered face is that I'm not prying into the secrets of my king, and perhaps the idea of not fully looking at the glory of God in all of its intensity. That could be indicated by this. But with 1 set of wings, they covered his face. With 2, he covered his feet. And with 2, he flew. And one called out to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And that seems to be what they're doing constantly. Praise of God. So a little bit different description than the cherubim for sure. And I think, though John doesn't mention them by name specifically, I think in Revelation chapter 4, I get the impression that he's probably encountering seraphim as well. In Revelation chapter 4 and verse 6. And around the throne were 24 thrones, and upon the thrones I saw 24 elders, sitting clothed in white garments and golden crowns on their heads. And from the throne proceeds flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder. And there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. And in the center and around the throne 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. And the first creature was like a lion, and the second creature like a calf. The third creature had a face like that of a man, and the fourth creature was like a flying eagle. And the four living creatures, each of them having 6 wings. So the 4 different faces sound like a cherubim, but the fact they have 6 wings makes you think maybe seraphim. So I don't know the differences between seraphim and cherubim, if it's only just 2 more wings and a slight difference in purpose. I don't know exactly. And they were full of eyes around and within, and day and night they do not cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, the Almighty, who was and who is to come. And they're there in heaven giving glory before God endlessly. And that, to me, ties in with Isaiah chapter 6, that they are praising God and saying, Holy, holy, holy. Pretty similar there. So, I probably just whetted your curiosity a little bit here without really satisfying it and giving you all the answers you want, but that's the best we can do with questions like this. Again, God wanted to keep the Bible to a manageable size, and so there's some things he chose not to tell us about or give us great details about, and that's okay, because the things he has clarified, the things he has given lots of detail, how we can be saved, what his expectations for his people are, what his will for our lives, those are pretty clear. That's what matters. We understand that God has his enemies, who are our enemies. We understand that God has his servants, who angels are described as ministering spirits. They're servants, and they work for God, and they work on our behalf as well. We don't know everything they do, but we ought to be thankful that they're there. We kind of wonder, we're amazed at these creatures, particularly seraphim. They're particularly interesting to me. But what we do know, for all we don't know about them, we do know God is wonderful, and they seem to know that too, because they're there forever praising God. And that's pretty cool. When the Bible says when we die, we're gonna be like angels, I like to read about this stuff and remind myself that praising God for all eternity is not gonna get boring. Seraphim don't find it boring. They haven't grown tired of it. God is just that amazing, just that awesome that, when we've been there 1,000 years, it'll seem like we just begun. I love that line in Amazing Grace. So this is just a great reminder to me. Let's be glad that God works things for our favor, that he makes promises and keeps them, and that he's got angels, cherubim, seraphim, these creatures that carry out his will that benefit us greatly. This hasn't been a lesson on how to become a Christian by any means, but certainly we're gathered here. We're a family. We're here to encourage one another. That's the reason why we gather. If you need prayers, if you need help to understand things in the Bible, you need instruction, you want to confess sins, you want to put on Christ in baptism, any of those are great reasons to come forward now as we stand and sing.